before. Sorry, I didn't pick an easy one that you can go down to the bookstore and purchase afterwards. How many people in this room have read this book? Well, we've got a couple. Okay, how many people have heard about it before today? Okay, wow, so there's a lot that haven't. Well, good, I'm glad. I hope today after the presentation that you'll go out and maybe find a copy somewhere. I was lucky enough, I have one of the original editions that's falling apart and scotch taped together. So I've read this book now in the last 20 years. Ahead of this presentation, that will be the third time that I've read it. And every time it's just so incredible. It's one of those books that you just get so attached to all of the characters and you become part of their journey. And you think about the characters long after you've read the book, and we all know books like that, and this is one of them. And I haven't really met anybody who has read this book that hasn't felt that. I'm going to have extra layers of connection to the book, but I think for the most part, that's the takeaway that most people have. You can advance the next slide. So a little bit about the author. I'm embarrassed to say in the 3 times that I've read this book, I knew nothing about Robert Wilder. And in my very brief internet search, I want to learn more. I don't know how, after you read the 600-page detailed historical, this detailed book that is done so well, I don't know how he had time to do all of these other things in his life. Like serve in the war. He wrote a screenplay that ended up starring Joan Crawford, and wrote 2 plays, one on Marcus Garvey and ended up on Broadway. I mean, what an incredibly talented human. So I actually want to learn more about Robert Wilder. He grew up in Florida, which may be why he already knew and had a strong connection to the Bahamas, because this book just depicts the Bahamas and its culture and its people so well as the Low Country and England. I mean, it's just so well written. Next slide. So a little bit about me that will explain why this book has had such a huge impact on me. My mother, the little tan one right there on the left, was born in England and moved to the Bahamas when she was 4 years old in 1949. And that's my father, the ultimate island boy on the right, who is a 3rd generation Bahamian. And his family, as far as we know, goes back to the Bahamas in 1890, because that's as far back as we can go with the handwritten script of birth records on the island of Managua, which is the furthest southern island. But that's my favorite picture of my father. I just love it. I don't even know what he's on. He's on like a pallet that he attached a motor to in Nassau Harbor. So I'm a British and a Bahamian citizen, and like Jesse said, came to the Low Country for college. So the Low Country has been part of my life, and I picked up a husband there as well in college. He's also from the Low Country. So, this place has been part of my life for the greater part of my life. Next slide. So the book. The foreword in the book actually does a really great job giving an overall synopsis of what it entails. I shortened it a little bit, but it says the settlement of the Bahama Islands was the result of one of the most dramatic migrations. From the plantation aristocracy of Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia came families who were passionately sincere in their loyalty to the British Crown and wanted nothing to do with the American Revolution and its theory on democracy. At their request, transports of the Royal Navy took entire families, their slaves, livestock, furnishings, and in some cases, even the bricks of their manors to the Bahamas. There they attempted to recreate the colonial magnificence they had known with mansions, slave quarters, and vast cotton fields. The failure was tragic, and the history of the Out Islands has been one of wealth and poverty in cycles brought about by influences far beyond their shores. And that last sentence hasn't changed. I mean, that is still how the Bahamas is today, heavily influenced by all things outside of its country. But to think, there's so many even Bahamians that didn't realize the connection between the Southeast and the coastal, especially the Carolinas, and on our culture. Next slide. So this book, I mean, it's over 600 pages in really fine print, so this is a real challenge to give a quick synopsis of that, because it follows 7 generations of one family. The book starts out with the Cameron family and Ronald Cameron at the top, the original patriarch and loyalist, who leaves his plantation, Cameron Hall, on the Ashley River outside of Charleston, with everything intact, and leaves everything behind on this new venture to recreate his life and his family's legacy on the island of Exuma. Next slide. So throughout the book, there's no pointer, so I can't point. You see Nassau, that's the capital with the red dot. But all of the other islands are what we call the Out Islands of the Bahamas. And essentially, it was the loyalists who settled the Out Islands of the Bahamas. I referenced my great-grandmother. This is the island that she was from, Great Anagua, Catherine Gray, my daughter's named after. And Great Exuma is where this story takes place, kind of right there in the middle. But throughout the book, the islands of Long Island and Cat Island and Eleuthera are referenced constantly because loyalists settled on all of those islands. My grandmother is from Eleuthera, and that's where my mom currently lives. So throughout this book, as they talk about places and they talk about settlements and how they were created, those places still exist today, and have meaning to me personally. So the king, Ronald, you can go back. That's the other one, sorry, one more. Nope, like forward. There we go. Yes. Thank you. Ronald Cameron was an influential, very wealthy, well-connected man. So the king granted him 2,000 acres on the island of Exuma, which essentially was the whole island, which happened on so many other out islands. I mean, again, this is historical fiction, but a very accurate account to factual events of what actually happened during this time period. Like I said, 600 pages, so I'm not going to go through all 7 generations that they talk about, but I'm going to talk about my favorites, which are the first 3, just to kind of give you a tease about what this book holds. So Ronald Cameron, the patriarch, the loyalist who left the Low Country and left everything behind, packed up all of his belongings, including the bricks of his manor, and shipped them to the Bahamas to recreate this life and to replant cotton in the Bahamas. I mean, you think about it now today, like nobody went down there to look at the Bahamas to see what it looked like before packing up and going on this venture and betting everything that they had. And he was a very stubborn Scotsman. Failure was not an option. And he never admitted defeat at every juncture, at every challenge. It was, defeat was not it wasn't an option. That was his family's legacy on Exuma that he was going to create at any cost, and he was going to continue that legacy. He took with him his 2 children from the Low Country to the Bahamas, Robert Bruce and Caroline. Caroline and her husband, Juan Cadiz, are my 2 absolute favorite characters. Caroline, well, I just love a good, strong female character in anything, whether I'm reading or watching a movie. And she is just all the things that I love about all the women that I love to surround myself with and admire. She has a strong sense of self, huge heart, all the grit. And she was 13 when she came to the Bahamas and just adjusted to island life in the best way possible. Juan Cadiz it doesn't remind me of my father because he's a bit of a pirate, but an absolute, bad island boy with an earring in his ear who sails around the Bahamas in his sloop, playing his guitar, drinking rum, not a care in the world, completely embodying everything that you think of when you think of the islands. Like, time doesn't matter, money doesn't matter, happy in the moment, just, does what he pleases when he pleases. Also incredibly good looking and knows it, and just breaks the heart of women through the islands everywhere he stops. And one day he saw this giant mansion that was built on the island of Exuma and sailed up to the dock and was greeted by a young Caroline Cameron, who completely just melted when she met this pirate with no shirt on and an earring in his ear. And so, unable to form words, and Juan knowing that, exactly what he was doing, courted Caroline, and they started meeting in secret. And she spent her afternoons walking the property on the balcony looking for this red sail, because Juan's sloop had a red sail, the only one in the islands. So when that red sail would come, they would go and rendezvous, and they fell madly in love. And then Ronald Cameron found out about it, and immediately, obviously did not agree and forbid it. And Caroline immediately, the next time she saw that red sail, hopped in the boat. They went to Eleuthera, and they were married by a missionary. And she moved to Long Island and lived in a little hut with him until Ronald came and managed not to strangle Juan Cadiz, but realized that he'd rather have his daughter with him, even if it meant living under the same roof with the pirate that she had just married. So for many years, they lived under the same roof and didn't talk, and wanted to play his guitar and drink his rum. And they'd sail around the Bahamas, and it's one of my favorite love stories in any book that I've ever read, because that generation of love stories between Juan and Caroline carries out through the next 6 generations, and it's always there, and it's one that defies all logic and expectation, and it's very sweet. And Robert Bruce, who's the son who's supposed to carry on the legacy and the expectation of his father, Ronald Cameron, to run the land and to keep the plantation going on in the Exumas, wanted nothing to do with it, and ended up leaving Exuma and moving back to Charleston, and had huge resentment for his father of giving everything up and moving the family to the Bahamas. So he moved back to Charleston. So there's a lot of the book that is, it's parallel lives in Charleston and the Bahamas happening throughout the whole book. And being uneducated, having grown up in the islands, he started working in an import-export business in Charleston and moved up the ranks. And as he became more successful, started purchasing Cameron Hall back on the Ashland River, and managed to piece back together the family's original land. And through the import-export business that he was in Charleston, was still able to work with his family in Exuma, because their lives changed from when the original thought of living off of the land. Instead of becoming a family of the land, they became a family of the sea, which I'll talk a little bit about in a bit. Juan Cadiz made a trip to Charleston in Robert Bruce's early career, and that was to bring David Heath, who you can see in the little dotted line with illegit in the parentheses. Sabrina Heath was the wife of the governor in Nassau, and Ronald Cameron and Sabrina had a time in Nassau, an exciting time, and during the cholera outbreak, when it swept through Nassau, the families were given enough time, the wealthy families were given enough time to get out to the Out Islands before they were affected. And so Sabrina showed up on Exuma with a 5-year-old, who was the first time that Ronald met his 5-year-old son. The governor ended up passing away from cholera, and Sabrina Heath found herself widowed and penniless. So she made the difficult decision to leave what was then, I think he was probably 7 by that time, on the dock in Exuma, and sailed away and left her 7-year-old to go back to England to try find a husband. And it would have been easier to find a husband without a 7-year-old in tow. So David Heath grew up on Exuma, but was the same age as Caroline and Juan's children, Bahama and John. So the 3 of them grew up in this very romantic childhood, similar to, I mean, not as romantic as mine, 200 years later, but still, I can relate. Exploring the islands and going fishing and all the wonderful things. But as they grew older, that romantic childhood became a little bit too romantic, and Bahama and David fell in love, not knowing that David was Bahama's own. It's really juicy, guys, for 1964, talking about the Revolutionary War time. So back to Juan's trip to Charleston. So Juan quickly volunteered to take David to Charleston away from Exuma. And at this time, they had transferred they realized that the soil of the Bahamas was not going to produce like the soil of the Low Country. So Juan stopped playing his guitar and somehow developed some ambition in life and realized that they could make a living off of the sea. And so they started sponging. And I remember as a child when sponging was still happening, I remember the docks being filled with them. That doesn't happen today, but even in my lifetime, that was still happening. You would take sponges off the seafloor and they would just air them out, and the whole, by the ports, there would be huge swaths of sponges. So they started sponging, and then he thought, well, there's a business here. We can cut out the middleman, and we could be trading with Bermuda and Cuba and Florida and the Carolinas. So he needed a boat to do that. So when he took David to Charleston, he was on a mission to find this perfect sloop that he had in his head that was going to transform the family and bring and sustain them in a way that was actually profitable. So he would wake up every morning and he would walk up and down King Street, and he would go to the wharf and he would find the best boat captains to ask them, where can I find this boat? This is the boat in my head, I know it exists, where can I find it? And I'm going to read you a passage because this is one of my favorite. It's an example of how good Robert Wilder was in describing the culture and the different cultures in the book and the people. So Juan and his son were sitting at a club at dinner, speaking to a Captain James, who was from the Northeast and very, like, one of the most well-respected captains, and he's trying to figure out where to find this boat. And so Captain James says, Maine. Captain James spoke the word like a challenge. You go to Maine. That's my advice. Take it or leave it. I don't give a damn. Juan glanced at John, his son, and saw a smile behind his son's eyes. This Yankee captain was someone beyond their experience. In the islands, men would have talked over something as important as this. They would argue, exchange opinions, offer information or alternatives with indolent and leisurely concern. They would have sat on a log in the sun and discussed every possibility, with everyone willing to listen to everyone else and sharing a jug or a bottle while the matter was being considered. Captain James was satisfied to solve this problem with a single word. I just love that passage. And when I read that, I think about this instance. We were at my parents' house on Eleuthera, and I was inside, I was walking out on the balcony, and my father and my brother and my cousin were standing out on the balcony. They were looking out over the water and the fruit trees. And they were in a really serious conversation. My husband Lloyd was standing outside with a smirk on his face. And I was like, what are they talking about? It's so serious. And Lloyd looked at me and he laughed. He goes, the breeze. It is a gift that we have as Bahamians to talk about nothing. And I love that. And I wish we all took more time to sit on a log in the sun and talk about everything and nothing at all. That's something that we all don't do enough, but we do it well in the Bahamas. Talk about the breeze for a good long hour, very serious conversation. But it turns out that Juan eventually found his boat of his dreams. What were original cotton farmers turned into spongers, and then tradesmen, and then illegal, selling illegal ammunition to the Confederate Army during the Civil War, to then selling illegal ammunition to the Cubans during the Cuban Revolutionary War. So the piracy of Juan Cadiz definitely transferred into the future generations, but really fascinating, fascinating times that they go through. So I took this picture actually this year. It's kind of fuzzy up on the screen, but it's really fuzzy, sorry. But that's Eleuthera, and that's pretty much, that's what it looks like today, and that's what it looked like then. You know, we have limestone islands with not deep soil, so you can imagine what that must have been like in the 1700s to pull up on a sloop to try and recreate what was in the Low Country with vast cotton fields on that kind of environment. Next slide. And then that's the new version. And as you can see, who's on the cover, my favorite, Juan Cadiz. Next one. And then the history, that's the second part about this book that I just love so much. It just goes through such pivotal times. And I learned things that I just never knew. And my mom did too. I mean, when she read this book, she goes, I learned more about the Bahamas through this book than I think, through, she doesn't remember or didn't learn, I don't know. But especially things like the Civil War. We didn't learn that in the Bahamas growing up, about how that affected the islands. And it had a huge effect on the Bahamas. That was a time of extreme wealth. And the Royal Victoria Hotel was built in Nassau during the Civil War because there was just so much wealth, and it's crazy to think that that's what was happening in the Bahamas while what was happening in the US. But the Royal Victoria Hotel is what brought my grandparents to the Bahamas in 1949. So it's really fascinating. And then down to the Cuban Revolution. I mean, it really spans all things. And the cholera outbreak in Nassau, we did learn about that. And as a child, I grew up having Easter egg hunts, and my children did too, in the cholera graveyard in Hopetown. And then you read about, it's like a big field. It sounds worse than what it is. It's not, but it's just, you read this book and it just, all of these things come to life as you read through them. Next slide. And then obviously the connection about how we are tied, the Bahamas and South Carolina, so much. When I went to the College of Charleston to look at Charleston as an option, I wasn't there very long before I knew that this is where I was going to end up, because it was something that I just kind of felt. But at the age of 17, I just really couldn't put my finger on it. I just thought, oh, this is, I just knew this is where I wanted to go. And then you fast forward 20 years with a husband and 2 Bahamian-born children later, and I'm standing in Beaufort as we're trying to figure out, we had lived in the Bahamas for the past 13 years, trying to figure out where we were going to move if we were moving back. And I was in Beaufort for no more than an hour before I looked at my husband. I was like, this is it. This is where we are going to live. This is where we are going to raise our family. Because it was something that I was so sure of. And I just knew, and it's a feeling. And that's because of this connection. And it's a feeling that you can't put your finger on, but as I read through this book, I'm like, well, that makes perfect sense. That's why. In 1834, the British government, through an act of parliament, abolished slavery in all British colonies. At that time in the Bahamas, there were 10,000 enslaved people and 3,000 freed slaves. Those 2,000, the white population was at 2,000. Those 13,000, and probably maybe half of the white population, is what populated the out islands of the Bahamas. So my culture, the Bahamian culture, essentially came from that of the Gullah Geechee culture here in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida. The dialect, the food, their street names, the last names, it's all very similar. But it's something that I very much felt, I guess, when I first came to Charleston. But, as a grown-up, I figured out, a little bit more why I felt this. And so, having not gone very far when I came to Beaufort and having that feeling, then I drove around St. Helena and I looked at my husband with like this look. I was like, oh, we're definitely making this happen. Like this is certainly where we belong. Because Beaufort is still a place that you feel, that still has a soul. If I was standing on, in the parking lot of a Home Depot or on the 9th green, I wouldn't have had that same feeling. I wouldn't have known where I was. I wouldn't have felt the history. Next slide. This picture is taken out of my mother's kitchen window. That is Sea Island cotton. That is not native to the Bahamas. And it is a reminder, who knows where the seed originated to create that plant. Maybe it was from here, I don't know. But it's a pretty powerful thing to have that outside my mom's kitchen window and to be here. I'm reminded daily. And as you read this book and you become invested with the characters, they sit back and, Juan Cadiz and Ronald Cameron and Robert Bruce, you go on this journey of their life with them, and then at the end of their life, they sit back and they reflect on everything, and it makes you think about your life and what you're contributing, because you watch how everything that they did, how it affects the next generation. And, I want my kids to always feel and know, to feel the connection between their two homes, between the Bahamas and the Low Country. And they're not going to feel that if it disappears. So the work that Jesse spoke about and that we do every day is really important. It's the same work that I did in the Bahamas, and I feel like one affects the other, because it is essentially connected, and that connection isn't just with me because I'm from the Bahamas. I mean, I meet people every day that live here, that have sailed through the Bahamas, and there's always been a connection. And when I moved here, somebody said to me, well, we know you'll come back. The wind blows south from the Carolinas. And that's exactly true. So that's all I got. If there's any questions.